democratisation, bringing Australia and Indonesia closer together, and what are the issues? We have two very learned speakers on this topic, both with experience on the ground in West Papua. So first we'll hear from Dr. Jaap, who's a senior lecturer in anthropology at Macquarie University. He did anthropological fieldwork in West Papua in the 90s, and for the past 12 years he's been working in the Solomons, concentrating on religious movements in the Pacific.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for inviting me, Kate, and all the other people who have been involved in finding me. Because, as said, like, I've done fieldwork and I have experience on the ground in West Papua in the 1990s. Sorry, I'm kidding. Which sounds like a really long time ago. But I have been back, and I keep following the news on Papua, and I keep in touch with West Papuans that visit Australia or the Netherlands, where I'm originally from. So if I'm in the Netherlands, I usually catch up with West Papuan friends as well. So I feel that I'm still relatively well informed. But probably, as my talk will show, I'm not that well informed. So I'd like to get some feedback as well and corrections on anything that I'm going to say, which will mostly come from learned scholars at this table, I hope. So, so let me start. In 2008, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra published a paper by the title "Seeing Indonesia as a Normal Country." And the report notes, and I quote, "At the time of the Bali bombings in October 2002, Indonesia was seen at best as a messy state. One thought to be either balkanizing in the aftermath of Suharto's authoritarian New Order, or on the verge of being engulfed in radical Islam, with Indonesia's supposedly mainstream pluralist majority quiescent in the face of radical voices and religiously inspired violence and terrorism. Yet, Indonesia today, and this is 2008 when the report was published, has one of the world's most successful track records in combating terrorism." And the report continues to state that Islamist parties have failed to attract voters. There's generally little support for radical agendas in Indonesia, and the overwhelming majority of voters have rewarded center-nationalist, mainstream, generally secular parties in the hundreds of local elections conducted since 2005. The national focus has settled on the cost of living, poverty, jobs, and of course, politics. Now, the paper argues that contrary to Australia's way of thinking about the country, Indonesia is a stable, competitive democracy, playing a constructive role in world affairs. It is no longer, as the report says, in a state of profound flux and turmoil. Indeed, we now know what Indonesia is probably going to look like over the next decade. And I think we do know, to some extent. The report was right. Almost a decade later, Indonesia is still a stable and competitive democracy, playing a constructive role in world affairs. The plea for seeing Indonesia as a normal country has, however, largely fallen on deaf ears in Australia. Why is this the case? Just recently, Australian-Indonesian relations were thrust into the spotlight after people smugglers told Indonesian police that they had been paid thousands of dollars by Australian officials to turn around a boat carrying 65 asylum seekers, which later ran aground on a reef. A few months earlier, the executions of Australian drug smugglers Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran sparked outrage in Australia, and the Australian government withdrew its ambassador to Indonesia. In 2013, hopes of a renewed relationship following the election of Tony Abbott got quickly dashed when documents obtained by the ABC and The Guardian Australia revealed Australian intelligence attempted to listen to the then President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's phone calls in 2009. In 2006, Australia granted asylum to 42 West Papuan refugees, a decision Indonesia calls incorrect, unrealistic and unilateral. In 2004, relations are boosted when Australia provides $1 billion in aid and interest-free loans to Indonesia in the wake of the Boxing Day tsunami. And in 1999, relations are strained when Australia intervenes in East Timor, helping secure its independence from Indonesia to get access to its oil fields. All these events have something to do with sovereignty, nation building and nationalism. The question then rises, why did the Australian Strategic Policy Institute paper fail to discuss sovereignty and nation building if it is around these issues that Jakarta tends to get upset? If government leaders and policymakers fail to get this, it is probably not because they are ignorant or arrogant, but more likely because they tend to see Indonesia as a normal country, which in many ways it is not. Just like any other country is not normal, including Australia. In other words, seeing Indonesia as it is involves recognizing not just how much progress it has achieved in reforming the way it operates, but also to see how weird and yet familiar it is when it comes to nation building and nationalism. The kind of stuff that anthropologists like me and culturally sensitive political scientists love. So let's look quickly at what some of my colleagues at the Australian National University, the national university, the institution that should know, knows for its close link, and also known for its close link with the government, in this case the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAT. What do they publish? What do they write? What do they research in order to foster a better understanding of Indonesia? What are the Indonesian experts at the ANU doing and what are they not doing? Let's look at the university's 2014 update on Indonesia, which should be give an indication of the state of the art of research being conducted at this prominent institution. This Indonesia update is part of a series of yearly updates that tend to feature issues that appeal to policy communities that, rather than publishing or discussing thought-provoking scholarly investigation. In 2014, the 2014 gathering led to the publication of the book entitled The Yudhoyono Presidency, Indonesia's Decade of Stability and Stagnation. And it's edited by Edward Espinel, Marcus Mitzer, and Dirk Thompson. Let's read the blurb and the contents, some of the contents. This is an edited volume, so it has a lot of chapters, and draw some preliminary conclusions. The blurb reads like this. The presidency of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono from 2004 to 2014, so that's 10 years of a presidency, was a watershed in Indonesia's modern democratic history. Yudhoyono was not only the first Indonesian president to be directly elected, but also the first to be democratically re-elected. Coming to office after years of turbulent transition, he presided over a decade of remarkable political stability and steady economic growth. But other aspects of his rule have been the subject of controversy. While supporters view his presidency as a period of democratic consolidation and success, critics view it as a decade of stagnation and missed opportunities. This book is the first comprehensive attempt to evaluate the achievements and the shortcomings of the Yudhoyono presidency, with contributions from leading experts on Indonesia's politics, economy, and society. No one on culture, no one on nationalism. And then it assesses the Yudhoyono record and failing in the fields ranging from economic development, human rights, to foreign policy, the environment, and of course, the security sector. So we have titles of chapters reading like Men on Horseback and Their Droppings, Yudhoyono's Presidency and Legacies and Comparative Regional Perspective. Yudhoyono's Foreign Policy. We have a section on Institutions, Politics and Security. It's all very state-focused and governance-focused, which is not surprising for an institution that tends to advise the government in Canberra. Yudhoyono's Legacy on internal security, which is, of course, a major field of concern in Canberra. Toning down the Big Bang, the politics of decentralization, which may destabilize the country and still lead to that balkanization that Australia was so fearful of only a decade earlier. Human rights, major issue of course. And the Indonesian economy. So we have economists contributing to this as well. But there's no chapter on culture, on the legacies of the old state, of all the cultural patterns, all the cultural traditions. And there's no chapter on nationalism. In fact, nationalism is hardly mentioned in this book. Now, let us compare this with one of the really groundbreaking publications on Indonesia, which was published a few decades ago, which is James Siegel's A New Criminal Type in Jakarta, published in 1998. The topic of this long essay is the 1983 to 1984 massacres of so-called criminals that occurred in Indonesia. These murders took place at night, needless to say, without any subsequent trial, and were perpetrated by the state's military apparatus as the smiling General Suharto openly acknowledged. These petty criminals, many of whom had been in the employ of the government's party Golkar during the preceding elections, were very much part of the people, the little people, the rakyat as it is said in Indonesian. The author's claim is that in the Indonesian mind, an idea of death existed which was associated with the acts of those supposed criminals. However, since the murders were committed by the state during Suharto's dictatorship, which ran from 1966 to 1998, the massacres were an attempt to nationalize this notion of death. By this, James Siegel means that a semantic association of the notion of murdering criminals with the development of Indonesian nationalism was created. This was possible because after 1966, the word people, rakyat as I said, disappeared and was replaced by that of the nation. So we have a nation state without people, but just with a nation, with a form of nationalism without people. The populace became an illegitimate category, just like criminals, in the vocabulary of the bloodthirsty anti-communism of General Suharto's New Order regime. Criminals then became semantically and then physically a type of people, and they disappeared. The culture of a codified state of law in Indonesia has always been weak, and the role of the customary law of great importance. What happens then when the family, this nation, this idea of a nation, is explicitly relegated to the realm of custom, and the nation state, through a massive ideological advance, tries to take over the effect, the emotional role of the family, and to derive its legitimacy from that local institution. In an archipelago like Indonesia, there are many types of family, as there are ethno-linguistic groups. The translocal state tried to move the emotional authority it coveted from the family towards the nation state, and by doing so, the government attempted to become the authority of a family outside itself. Clearly, James Siegel believes that for the Indonesian nation, the ability to substitute the state for the family is a guarantee of patrimonial morality, and even better, legitimacy. Put more crudely, by leaving corpses in public places all over the archipelago, the uncurtailed power of the state is proclaimed through a reconstruction of death as the national domain. Even the marginal power of petty criminals could be transformed in a declaration of supremacy of the new order. In Sukarno's popular speeches, the people lost its voice to its mouthpiece, the demagogic president. And with the arrival of General Suharto and the horrendous anti-communist massacres of 1956 and 1966, during which some 300,000 people got killed, the people were deprived of their voice. Their disappearance is nonetheless indicated by their shadows. That lingering menace. The criminal, a potential guerrilla or a gossiper, sometimes even on the influence of foreign forces, who the Pancasila state believes to continue to threaten it. James Siegel then claims that in the Indonesian language, certain associations like accountability and revenge had gone missing. They're no longer part of the popular vocabulary. The question posed here has occurred to many social science researchers in Indonesia. Despite the need for revenge, in Indonesian dendam, the survivors of the successive New Order killings can't preserve a narrative of their versions of facts. So quite logically, Siegel goes looking for a narrative structure of psychological repression, and unsurprisingly, he finds it in the hands of the police state. This essay came at the right time, since the question of state violence did not diminish in importance since the fall of General Suharto, as the ongoing massacres in West Papua and the regular dead bodies of Papuan students all over the country show. Certainly, the culture and social morphology of violence have always been at the center of concern for Indonesia watchers, but increasingly they will need to be done at the level of the circulation or obstruction of values between a state questing for legitimacy and or dictatorial exploitation of its population, and the citizens attempting to construct their own biographies under the supposed rule of law. And the social construction of confidence in Indonesia has always been impossible, has been all but impossible. The state is struggling with its own ability to forge durable contracts with its populace, hence the need for monuments made of cadavers. Perhaps if we again open our eyes for these dimensions of Indonesian life, we will understand a bit fuller the kind of accusations recently proffered by the head of the intelligence organization BIN, Sutioso, following the burning of shops and the mosque in Tolikara in Papua nearly 2 weeks ago. A week later, Sutioso claimed that there were several parties of interest that made use of the Tolikara incident to attack the government and its institutions, actually to attack the president, is what he said. He said it's possible that the attack came from foreign parties, and the police are still investigating. Foreign involvement is possible, he said on Wednesday, July 22. Sutioso claimed that BIN, the intelligence organization, had warned local authorities that conflict was imminent, and on July 11, a week before the attack. And he underlined that the intelligence had carried out its task by informing local authorities. So what to make of this recent event in light of James Siegel's thesis? Obviously, any good analysis will elucidate a large number of elements in a complex interaction with each other. In the remainder of this talk, I would like to focus on one of those elements, to suggest that the conflict in Papua should be seen as a case of problematic nation building. Considering its own problems with integrating an Aboriginal minority and building Australia, Canberra should be able to relate to what Jakarta faces with respect to Papua. That's my perhaps most controversial thesis of this evening. Let me explain. Ernest Gellner argued that in contemporary perception, national membership has become as normal as having a face with a nose and two ears. For Gellner, nationalism is primarily a political principle that holds that the political and the national units should be congruent. In previous times, during what he calls the agro-literate stage of history, rulers had little incentive to impose cultural homogeneity on the ruled. But in modern society, work becomes technical. One must operate a machine, and as such, one must learn. There's a need for impersonal, context-free communication and a high degree of cultural standardization. Nationalism only appeared, and Gellner argues, became a sociological necessity in the modern world. In the post-colony, like Indonesia, the idea of nation and attendant nationalism was inspired mainly by the colonizers, the Dutch, and the rise of nationalism among anti-colonial movements elsewhere. It is a well-known fact that Papua came late in Indonesia's nation-building project. Papuans were namely not part of the emergence of nationalism on Java and adjacent islands, and only became part of Indonesia's nation-building project as of 1962, after Indonesia took over the territory from the Dutch. Before that, only the idea of Papua as an integral part of the country, liberated from Dutch colonialism, played a part in the largely Java-based nationalism. One of the consequences of coming late into a project like nationalism, and with the added disadvantage of being culturally different, is that your culture, language and behavior will be perceived as abnormal and as things to be corrected, to be standardized. Efforts to further nationalize societies can thus be seen as efforts to install or reinstall normality. With the advent of territorial normality, that is the restoration of the boundaries established by the Dutch, divisions between people became articulated by nationalists as abnormal, and even most of that argumentation was copied from the ways the Dutch depicted Papuans as Stone Age people, the last unknown, and people in need of fraternal guidance from a more advanced group of people. Territorial normality, however, also requires the construction of a historiographical normality. And Papua is an extreme case in that regard. As after Indonesia's independence, the historiographical integrity was domestically constructed using such ancestral legacies as the Sriwijaya Kingdom and the Majapahit Kingdom, of which Papua was never a part, or let's say a prominent part. Consider this narrative then by a prominent Papuan intellectual and a futurist, Don Flassi. Flassi wrote, amid 20-odd books and hundreds of articles, a constitution for the state of Papua, which is part of a historiographical project and part of a nation-building project, a part of building a foundation, which a constitution is, for a state and for a nation. Let's have a look what this text says. It's a very long text, and I'll only deal with parts of it. This constitution is the result of Papuans becoming increasingly focal towards local and distant audiences, communicating historical, racial and national arguments as part of their pursuit of freedom since the fall of Suharto. Most publications by Papuans so far produced tend to discuss human rights violations and the injustices surrounding the transfer of Papua to Indonesia, mostly following, I must say, Western discourse on Papua. Only a few imagine how a new state or nation might be constituted. Now, standing out is Don Flassi's text, which is titled Basic Guidelines, State of West Papua, the Papua-Melanesian threefold logic, its basic ideology, and its general governance, and the Constitution of West Papua, which is the final chapter of the book. It was published in 1999. It's the founding document for an awaited sovereign state of West Papua. Basic Guidelines demonstrates Flassi's erudition and creativity. And like the two previous narratives, and it is a potent blend of biblical, customary, and modern discourse. So it has stuff from the Bible, it has stuff from West Papuan customs, which are sort of like aggregated in quite funny forms in the text, and there's a lot of modern discourse, particularly on human rights. Being a constitution and not an outline of the evolution of mankind or a local historical narrative, the text revolves even more intensely around the ideas of sovereignty and morality. The Constitution shows a creative combination of Christian principles, the popular OPM, or the Papua Freedom Movement slogan, "One people, one soul," international human rights principles, anti-colonial discourse, and a fascination with numerical correspondence. Remarkably, "One nation, one soul, and one solidarity," this slogan, resonates with the catchphrases in the 5 Irian Barat, or West Papua, speeches by President Sukarno. Sukarno's speeches regarding Irian Barat, as it was then called, are mainly anti-colonial and speak of Indonesia's right to re-establish the unity of the nation, as it allegedly existed during the struggles against the colonial powers. This unity includes Irian Barat, it includes West Papua, and therefore the Dutch had to leave West New Guinea. The Indonesian National Party ideologue and then Minister of Information Ruslan Abdul Ghani further developed this premise in Dari Sabang sampai Merauke, Satu Nusa, Satu Bangsa, from Sabang to Merauke, one country, one people in 1964. A guideline for the Indonesian nation, now including West New Guinea, West Papua or Irian Barat in those days, around the same time in the Birdshead region, the OPM, the Papua Freedom Movement, was shaped in terms of a struggle for a separate nation. Indonesian propaganda inspired their attempt at nation building, Satu Bangsa, Satu Jiwa, one people, one soul. Paradoxically, in spite of the anti-Indonesian bend of Flassi's initiative, his rhetoric resonates with the rhetoric of Indonesia's liberation of the North New Guinea in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And for all the racial and ethnic tension between Indonesians and Papuans, for all of its anti-colonial rhetoric, this constitution, the basic guidelines for West Papua, also emulates Indonesian state ideologies from the preceding decades. By emulating the Indonesian state, Flassi powerfully unmasks the Indonesian state and presents an alternative state, the state of West Papua, or a state within a state, if you want, or sovereignty within a sovereignty, to be built on the remnants of a lost Edenic order, in which Christian principles converge with customary rules. Customary rules and mission Christianity mutually assent to each other, and together they are tantamount to justice, dignity, and sovereignty, or one people, one soul, one solidarity. So here's an attempt to rewrite the history of Papua and to produce something that can be used constructively in building a nation. In building a nation as different from the nation-building project that is run by the Indonesian state from Jakarta. At the same time, disappointingly, from the side of Jakarta, national history writing continues to exclude Papuans, apart from some passages legitimizing territorial claims. Onin as part of the Majapahit poetry or the text. There's actually some mention made of Onin in the Majapahit and some of the old Majapahit texts. And Onin is part of Papua, and hence there's a claim, and in Indonesia there's an old claim, an old legacy of Papua being part of the Indonesian nation. How to explain Papua's reluctance to engage with Papua in terms of its nation-building project, and sort of to engage critically with what the Papuans think of their own nation in relation to Indonesia. If Papuans are already emulating some major phrases of the Indonesian nation-building project, why not do the opposite and do the same thing and find some common ground? Consider a recent report in the Papuan daily Jubi with the headline, "Jakarta fails to protect indigenous people, Papuans," by Mawal Beni, and I quote from the article. A Papuan councillor accused Jakarta of reneging on its promises to establish regulations to protect indigenous Papuans. The Papua Legislative Council is constantly talking on such issues to protect indigenous Papuans, but execution of actions can only be done after consultation between the Legal Bureau and the Ministry of Domestic Affairs in Jakarta. The Secretary of the Commission 1 of the Papua Legislative Council, Matea Mamawai, said during a seminar held by the student executive body of Jayapura Science and Technology University titled "Are Papuans Truly Melanesian?" at the USTJ Hall, Abepura, Jayapura on last Saturday. Jakarta always rejects, I'm continuing to cite from the article, Jakarta always obstructs. Further talking about the identity of the Papuans always has been messed up, not recognized. And I'm upset, but as an Indonesian citizen, I will keep on talking, said the lady of Chamorro origin from the Mimika Regency. Meanwhile, the deputy chairman of the National West Papua Parliament, Romario Yatipai, said this kind of rejection is not just happening now. It has been occurring since the General Assembly of the preparation body of the Indonesian independence. In the meeting, Papuans were identified as Melanesian instead of Malay, he said in Papua on Sunday, the 21st of June. Thus, he said, it's very true that the Republic of Indonesia, which is synonymous with the Malay race, does not include Melanesia. One of the results is the number of human rights violations in Papua. The arrest and murder of Papuan people are unconsciously part of that rejection. End of the quote. This problem has so far only evoked accommodation from the side of the Papuans, as I've shown through the example of the constitution written by Flossie, but no effort of overcoming the historiographical divide from Jakarta. Historians, politicians and intellectuals in Indonesia do not take measures to overcome the post-1963 Papuan identities that emerged in the divided Indonesia during the first decade of independence. Why? Is it that there's something sacred about the old state, the Majapahit kingdom, or all the other kingdoms that are cited in the national narrative of Indonesia, which limits its accommodation into the changing demands of nationalism for the new society? Is it for modern Indonesian historiographers as difficult to assimilate Papuans as it is for white Australians to integrate into the cultural and national legacies the Aboriginal people, despite the malleability of the latter? All this might indicate that Australia should be able to sit at the table with Indonesia and talk through some of the similarities between the two countries with respect to its issues about nationalism, so as to foster respect for each other's predicaments and perhaps help each other out. Why not set up scholarly and public debates about such commonalities and through frank discussion, discuss solutions together instead of continuing to accuse each other of disrespecting minorities in terms of human rights violations? Both countries have an appalling record of violating the rights and integrity of its colored minorities. And the solutions lie in sharing experience and ideas about fostering a better future and not in throwing mud, which politicians in Canberra are particularly good at. That's the end of my talk.